You know, it seems like there's a new large-scale, big-money standard tournament just about every weekend now. The Pro Tour was standard, and for what it's worth, not a day goes by anymore without somebody new wandering into my comment section and saying that they are ready to try standard again for the first time in years. So standard might actually be back a little bit, but you know what never went away? The sticker shock that you get when you're trying to build a standard deck. Have you seen the prices for Esper or Domain lately? Do yourself a favor, don't look at those. Don't do it to yourself or your bank account or your blood pressure. Seriously, don't, but with so many people looking to sleeve up, shuffle up, and standard up for the first time in so long, I figured it was time to dust off a once beloved series around these parts that we haven't done in way too long, right? Ladies and gentlemen, 5 decks, $5 a piece, all tested to play well against one another and all fun, unique, and most importantly, in a lot of people's eyes, kind of competitive too. All decks that showcase the power of budget and standard right now and make for a couple of nights of fun family festivities or with friends if that's what you're into. Is there no other F word that goes there? I'm not really sure. But either way, ladies and gentlemen, 5 decks, $5, Cowboy Edition.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back. Make sure you check out the Patreon if you're interested in supporting the content. Maybe like the video and, of course, sub to the sandwich. But let's get started with an Orzhov deck. Couldn't see that one coming, right? I mean, sun rises and I go to sleep. But when I do wake up, I almost always end up making an Orzhov deck at some point that day, so this shouldn't surprise you too much. You know, that said, I'm pretty sure this is one of the first, or maybe even the first Orzhov deck that's ever been a part of the 5 for 5. I'm probably wrong on that, but I really don't think we've done as much Orzhov as I've wanted to do. That said, we finally get to do an Orzhov deck for the 5 for 5, and it's one of the coolest and honestly best decks that I've ever done for a 5 for 5. That can actually be said about just about every deck in the video. They're really making commons and uncommons kind of amazing nowadays, like Nurturing Pixie, for instance. Now, this might not look like too much when you first look at it, but this little lady allows you to pick up anything on your side of the table, put it back into your hand, which again is not like too much of a hook. It still doesn't sound too powerful, but you'd be surprised at the amount of budget permanents that want to be picked up and then put back down in standard right now. And I would know something about that. I have cats. And if we do put something back in her hand with NP, she becomes a 2/2 flyer for 1 mana, which is kind of like the best 1 mana stat line in the history of Magic. So again, they're making uncommons like really, really good now, but they're also making cards that go well with this nowadays. So let's look at all the stuff in the deck, and there is a lot of stuff in this deck that goes with this card. My 2 favorite cards in the whole deck to pick up with a Pixie are Hopeless Nightmare and Okiba Reckoner Raid, mostly for style points. I mean, I know that is a rad jacket the Raid's wearing, but when you look at the Hopeless Nightmare, you're playing that multiple times in the first couple of turns of the game. That's 4 life loss by the opponent and 2 cards they have to pitch. That's actually serious. There have been multiple times where I'm staring at my opening hand and it's 2 Pixies and a Hopeless Nightmare and it just causes this like maniacal laughter. But when it comes to the Okiba Reckoner Raid, that also does damage directly to the opponent. So between these 2 cards on screen, we're kind of an Orzhov burn deck, and I can certainly dig that. And these turn 1, turn 2 curve combos with the Pixie feel really good to pull off with these 2 cards, especially. Again, with Hopeless Nightmare, the opponent's down 2 cards and they've already taken 4 on turn 2, and you have a 2/2 flyer. You're playing modern, you know? It feels really, really good. And Okiba Reckoner Raid lines up really well on turn 1 and 2 with the Pixie too. So really nice cards here that work well by themselves or with the Pixie, which I think is an important theme to hold in a deck like this. You want your cards to be really good with your feature card, right? But you also want them to function well on their own in a vacuum, which is also the case with cards like, say, Novice Inspector and Norn's Inquisitor and Resolute Reinforcements. We're playing 4 of every card that I've shown you so far. Now, we are having to splurge a little bit for a couple of the cards on your screen. A lot of the budget went to both Novice Inspector and Resolute Reinforcements, but these are 2 of the most important cards in the deck. Mostly because they're 2 of the best cards in Standard. Like, on some level, these are both kind of in like the top 50 cards in Standard, so absolutely play these. They're both good to pick up with a Pixie, and so is Norn's Inquisitor for that matter, because you're going to be getting a lot of incubates. Cards like Reinforcements might look a little bit out of place to some people in a deck like this, but we do have the perfect 1-2 punch with it in our removal suite. We've got 4 Case of the Gateway Express to go with our Reinforcements, but we've also got 4 Annex Sentry and 2 Shoot the Sheriff. Man, MTG YouTube has got content creators saying the weirdest stuff, right? We've also got a Shoot the Sheriff in this deck. Come on, man. But this is just a really, really good and conveniently very inexpensive removal spell right now. NX Sentry is really great at picking up a token with its Enter the Battlefield ability and then getting returned to your hand with a Nurturing Pixie. So it does have a function with Pixie, but it's also just a really solid removal spell on a body in this deck. That's kind of hard to get rid of with a ton of different removal spells, but there's also this 4-case of the Gateway Express, which is actually kind of our premier removal spell. There's a ton of creatures in this deck, and Resolute Reinforcements really helps us push the creature count and remove just about whatever we want, especially in the early to mid game with a case. But Resolute Reinforcements also helps us attack with the requisite number of creatures to actually get an Anthem effect out of this, which is also really important for the deck. I also like that NX Sentry is a removal spell that counts towards one of our other removal spells. It's all very nice and synergistic. Is that a word? I'm not sure, but there is another card in this deck that's non-land, and it's me. Hello, it's me again. It's Michiko's Reign of Truth. The card isn't me. The card is this card. That was kind of confusing the way I worded it for a second there. But yeah, if you haven't noticed, there's actually 28 different cards in this deck. That's a lot. That either are artifacts or enchantments, like Case of the Gateway Express, Hopeless Nightmare, and the NX Sentry is an artifact, right? Or they make an artifact, like Norn's Inquisitor makes an artifact, Novice Inspector makes an artifact. So tons and tons of cards in this deck are either artifacts or enchantments, or they create them or whatever. So we're going to get a huge boost for a couple of turns off of Michiko's. Maybe make that Nurturing Pixie fly in for like 6 damage. Pretty easy to line that up, but also doubles as the biggest creature in our deck in most games, right? It's going to be like a 5/5 once it flips over and transforms. So great card. I don't know why more people aren't playing this thing. It's only like, what, 10, 12 cents to get your hands on one of these right now, and I think that's a very, very good price. So yeah, I'm on all 4 of this, and I think you might be able to go down to 2 and make room for some other stuff, but I'm not really willing to. The card is very good. Oh wow, it's actually less than that. Apparently it's 7 cents is what Scryfall said the price was when I looked this up. Anyway, there's 22 lands total in this deck because our curve is super low. We don't play any 4-drops, and I think we play a grand total of 4 3s. So yeah, we can afford to come down a little bit on the lands in this deck, but either way, we're on 12 plains and 10 swamp. We do need a fair amount of swamps. Some black sources on turn 1 for Hopeless Nightmare, Oathkeeper, Reckoner, Raid, whatever. But for the most part, we're mostly casting white spells in this deck, so it's a little bit more tipped towards the plains side of things. Now, of course, this is, I should just say this for this deck, and it also holds true for every deck we'll look at tonight, save for maybe one theoretically, but still, if you have the lands, upgrade them. You know, if you've got Concealed Courtyards or the other ones, Caves of Koilos or anything like that. Those are the lands that you want for a deck like this. But to stay in budget, we mostly play basic lands in all of these. Now, just it's kind of an overview here. There's a reason I chose to talk about this deck first. It's probably my favorite deck we'll talk about today. I don't know if it's the best deck we'll talk about today, but I do know it's Orzhov, everybody. So there's probably that sort of bias on my end. But at the same time, this is just a really, really fun deck to play in the arena. I've gotten a bunch of games in ranked in with this deck and actually had some success, but especially when you're unladdering, when you're in unranked and just the play queue. This is a really, really fun deck to just kind of mess around with, which is true of a lot of the decks today, but especially this one. Again, maybe I was a little hasty when I said it's like playing modern, but at the same time, I do feel like a lot of these like 1, 2, 3, and even 4 turn 4 plays you can get up to with this deck all feel really overpowered if you get just the right start. And again, even if your start is just Nurturing Pixie and like 2 Hopeless Nightmares, you're going to have the time of your life. So really try this deck out. What are we calling that one? Pixie Sticks. That's right. They all have clever names. So let's move on to Funeral Varmints. You've heard of Funeral Garments? Have you? Has anybody, am I just making up that turn of phrase in my head? Is it a weird Mandela effect? I'm not sure. Either way, Funeral Varmints is what we're calling this one. Seems like it's in poor taste. Either way, this, it's because of this card. It's because of this card in the Cowboy set. It's called Rise of the Varmints. Have you read this card yet? It's very good. I don't know. I haven't really seen anybody talk about this card, but once you're actually done reading it, it's great. You know, it may cost 4 mana, but it's 3 to plot for what that's worth. And you get a 2/1 for each creature in your graveyard, which can be a lot of 2/1s. I was actually kind of inappropriately excited for this card. I feel like I try to build the like graveyard deck just about every season. We've had Stick Fingers and Lurgoyfs and Souls of the Lost and Cruel Somnophage. It's just all these cards that care about how many things are in your yard, and they scale and get really tall, but we've never really had a great way to go wide with a deck like this. We do have a card in Standard that makes a bunch of Decayed Zombies you can't block with, and it's bad. At least it has Flashback, but it's just not a very good card. But this deck has always kind of needed to go more wide than it goes tall, and we finally have the opportunity to do that because of a card like this. And you might think I would immediately want to make this deck Golgari and play Undead Butler and all the fun stuff, and I do want to do that, but instead what we've done is we've gone Gruul here for a very specific reason that we'll get to kind of towards the end of the deck tag, but it's a very good reason, I promise you. Now, this deck does play Urborg Lurgoyf. I didn't mean to, like, poop on it a little bit back there a second ago. This is still a very, very large man, and so is Stubborn Burrow Fiend. For that matter, this can actually be, like, sneakily, low-key better than Urborg Lurgoyf on a lot of turns, not only because it starts life as a 2-2, like, no matter what, whereas Lurgoyf is always like a piddly old 0-1 if you got nothing in your yard. So at least Burrow Fiend's always going to be a 2-2, but you can actually saddle it the turn it comes into play, even if you don't plan on attacking with it, just to mill yourself. You can then saddle it on your opponent's turn if you have the ability to do that somehow and mill yourself some more. So it's just always supplying itself, like its own power, and your Lurgoyfs, and your Rise of the Varmints, just by saddling up, you know. Whenever you first mount it, that's even worse, saddle it the first time every turn, you're going to be milling some cards, and that is actually a huge gain for a deck like this. I kind of fell in love with this card over the course of playing with this deck. Again, I like it more than Lurgoyf, which I really didn't think I would say, but the card is actually kind of a boss. But we can't just rely on Burrow Fiend to do all of our milling for us. We got to get Death Bonnet Sprout, Blanchwood Prowler, and Patient Naturalist in here to do some milling and such too. There's 4 copies of all of these as well in the deck. Sprout is surprisingly cheap to buy. I just figured this would be like a quarter at the very least, but no, it's half that. And it's actually just about the best one-drop a deck like this could ever hope for. And honestly, there's a number of one-drops I considered, but there just really aren't any better than Sprout. Gnawing Vermin comes close, but it just does not quite get there. Sprout is, honestly, if you don't count Lurgoyfs or Burrow Fiends, just about the biggest creature in our deck once the game gets going. And it can mess around in our opponent's graveyard, which can occasionally be really important. At least once it gets flipped over, it can do that. But there's also Blanchwood Prowler and Patient Naturalist to help us get the lands, and kind of importantly, Patient Naturalist can make a treasure token sometimes, which can also help you kick a Lurgoyf. You know, you can like throw blue or black mana onto a Lurgoyf to actually, you know, kick it and mill some cards. So like the treasure token is consequential on occasion in this deck, so just keep that in mind. But for the most part, these are going to be things that get you lands and mill cards, and you don't mind blocking with because you honestly just want more dudes in your yard no matter what. So these are speed bumps that do the thing your deck wants to do. Along those same lines, we got Teachings of the Kirin in here as a 4 of and a 2 of Obsessive Astronomer. Did you know this card existed? I didn't know before I started building these decks, but this is just a 2-2 for 2 mana, which I guess is a fine stat line if you care. But the cool thing about this is that whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, so yeah, you have to track day-night in paper, and I know everybody hates it, but it's worth it because whenever one of those things happen, you get to discard up to 2 cards and then draw 2 cards. So that is throwing stuff into your graveyard, creatures, ideally, right? And then drawing fresh cards if you're looking for your Rise of the Varmints or your combo piece. Yes, there's a combo piece. Again, we'll get to it in a second. Obsessive Astronomer is not the reason we're playing Mountains in this deck, but it is a good reason to play Mountains, and you might as well while you have red mana. So good thing here, but Teachings of the Kirin I actually agonized over because even though this is rare, it's actually really cheap to put in the deck, so the price isn't the problem. It's the fact that it's not a creature, and we really have to play a ton of creatures in this deck, but it makes a creature, it makes other creatures larger, it messes around in graveyards and stuff like that, and it mills cards. So I just figured of all the things we could play in this deck that mill us, this is probably one of the best at the 2 mana slot. But let's justify them Mountains. Here's Witty Roastmaster and especially Imodane's Recruiter. Now, Roastmaster, if you Rise of the Varmints and you have like 10 guys in your yard, you just fireball them for 10 when you do that. And that's great. And you laugh about it. You have good times. You sip your coffee and you talk about it 5 years later. You remember that time when I don't know why you have an old man's voice. You remember that time 5 years ago? Yeah, we're 32 now. I don't know why you talk like that. Immodane's Recruiter is actually the way you're hoping to end the game, like, I don't know, 85% of the time in this pile, because you're just going to play your Rise of the Varmints, hopefully from plot. You can have the mana in play to actually do both things in the same turn. It doesn't cost that much. 7 mana, you know, we can make that some of the time. But ideally, you plot your Rise of the Varmints, and then you play your Immodane's Recruiter after you play your free Rise of the Varmints, and you just give all your Varmints +1/+0 in haste. You get in, and you kill your opponent. It's very likely you will kill them with your, like, you know, 10 to 15 varmints that are all hasty and angry. So, and you'll be talking about that 5 years later too. You remember that time? It's like, yes, David, we're 30. What? Now there's 12 forest and 10 mountain in this deck. Another 12-10 split here. And yeah, we're also playing 22 in this. You may have noticed that our curve didn't even get to 4 in this one either. So we're mostly playing up to 3 in this deck, and even then, we only need 3 mana for a couple of cards. So again, we don't have to like go crazy on the lands or the cheese whiz, as Beck would say, when it comes to making the mana base for this thing. But again, pretty easily upgraded with Karplusan Forest and Copperline Gorges and blah, blah, blah. Overview time. This is one of those decks where, like, even if your opponent sees what's happening to them, they might not be able to do anything about it, just because of Immodane's Recruiter. If they don't have counter spells or anything like that, even if they have the removal spell, a single spot removal spell does pretty much nothing against this, and even a sweeper does pretty much nothing against this when timed correctly. So I won a bunch of games in Standard with this deck, and again, it's only about $5 to build this thing. There's at least one deck today that goes just slightly over budget, but this is not the one. This is actually slightly a little under $5 if you don't count the lands, and you shouldn't count the basic lands. I'm not. But up next, let's go to the desert. Is there a desert behind me? We're still not doing green screen stuff on this channel? Been on YouTube for 8 years, not doing green screen stuff. Just can we put a picture of like Tatooine right here or something? Okay, the desert. A harsh, unforgiving landscape. A death sentence for any cowboy who finds themselves lost in it. It's also a magic deck. You know, there's a reason that like Ristic Studies is kind of the man when it comes to stuff like that, is because he would probably have some sort of thing to tie in to the fact that this is a magic deck and some cool story to tell. No, I just describe deserts and then say it's also a magic deck. That's what I do. We're playing deserts, Sultai deserts, as a matter of fact. I believe this might be one of the first 3-color decks in 5-for-5 history. Also, one of the only decks where we're going to count the lands and the prices. That's usually we just play basics, call it a day, right? But no, we got to play 4 copies of Lush Oasis in this thing, as well as 4 Festering Gulch and 4 Soured Springs. These are all lands that deal damage to our opponent when they come into play, and they make a couple of colors, which is really nice. Now, what I'd really like to do here is some sort of Aftermath Analyst, Splendid Reclamation thing with the deserts. This card's honestly kind of costs too much, you know? Like a playset of Aftermath Analyst is most of the budget at this point, so can't really do that, but we can still play some pretty sweet desert-centric stuff. We can play 4 whole copies of Colossal Rattleworm. This is only like 30 or 35 cents on TCG Player, so it does eat up some of the budget, but it's definitely worth playing, man. But there's 4 Spinewoods Armadillo and 4 Cactarantula in the deck, which I honestly was not super excited about playing, but I fell in love a little bit with it. You know, 5 mana seems like a bit much, but we can ramp into this very, very quickly in this deck, and in this kind of like pseudo format of 5-for-5 decks playing against one another. This is actually one of the biggest creatures for the smallest amount of mana you'll be paying for these stats. I imagine this is actually really good in draft. Haven't played that much OTJ draft, but this feels decent to me, but either way, Spinewood's Armadillo is an actually decent Magic card, and I know that to be the case. I've seen a bunch of content creators play this in their standard decks, and I can see why. It's kind of a herd migration that can also go and get a damage, you know? Like in this deck, it goes and gets a dual land that does a damage and gains us 3 life. Let's kind of go. And then like late in the game, once we've done our ramping, it is just about the biggest creature theoretically, in this entire, again, like little format of $5 decks playing against one another. So your opponent's going to have a hard time dealing with it when it comes down. And that is true whether you're playing against another $5 deck or just about anyone out there. Now, I also made room for 2 Bonnie Paul Clear Cutter in this deck, and 2 Make Your Own Luck for that matter. This is the only, like, card draw spell like any of these decks today, which like feels really, really weird, but it is a great card in a ramp deck. It's going to draw you 2 and give you a free Rattle Worm, a free Armadillo, a free Cactarantula, a free Bonnie Paul. Even if it's a free any other card in the deck, you got a thing for free, man. Like 5 mana is not too much to spend on this effect, because once you get to your next turn, you get to play the best card in your deck, like a lot of the time. That said, Bonnie Paul is probably the single most powerful card in this deck, and I know Rattle Worm is in this deck, and I didn't talk too much about it back there. That's because its power is kind of self-evident. It is basically the best card in the deck, but that said, Bonnie Paul creates the actual biggest creature in the deck and creates 2 creatures when she comes into play and draws you cards and ramps you more. This is just an absolutely disgusting Magic card once it's on the table, and opponents are just not going to have enough resources to deal with everything that it gives you most of the time. That said, we got to start looking at our ramp here. We got 4 copies of Map the Frontier, 4 Glimpse the Court, and 4 Dance of the Tumbleweeds. A super underrated card in my opinion, but when it comes to Map the Frontier, this is an explosive vegetation, invasion of Zendikar, whatever you want to call it, that shocks the opponent. It's gross, you know, it puts dual lands into play and shocks our opponent. It's just amazing, dude. Fixes our mana for the rest of the game all in one shot and does damage. Now, Glimpse the Core isn't doing any damage, and we don't care about what does it care about caves? Doesn't matter. We just want to go grab a forest on turn 2 and ramp into Rattle Worm on 3 and then tell the opponent thanks for coming out. You know, it's usually going to do it if they don't have the removal spell right then and there. But when it comes to Dance of the Tumbleweeds, this is also land ramp. This goes and gets a desert, you know, a dual land that deals damage to the opponent. Like, all that's actually great. And, you know, these 3 mana rampa thing, it's not entirely unplayable just by itself, but this is also, 5 total mana to make a very, very large man. Extremely large man. Now, you can do both things if you have enough mana to do that. That's not unheard of. You might as well. It's kind of like giving your dude a +1/+1 counter, but, you know, even if you're just like making a 5/5 with this, that is well worth the mana that you spent on it. And then later in the game, when you're making a 9/9 or an 8/8 or whatever it is you're doing with it, again, you're kind of effectively making like a copy of the legend that Bonnie Paul puts into play, the big blue ox or whatever. Like you're kind of making a copy of that. And that should convince you this can be a very powerful card. It's ramp when you need it, and it's a huge dude when you need it too, and it's all on one card. But sadly, we kind of have to interact with our opponent like a little bit sometimes. So we're playing 4 copies of Rona's Vortex and 2 Witness Protection. Now, Rona's Vortex is the only quote-unquote black card in our entire deck. We can kick this with mana from Festering Gulch or Soured Springs or whatever, but there's also Witness Protection, which actually kind of costs more than I thought it would. It's like 20 cents for this thing right now. That's because I'm sure EDH players have sniffed out that it's a halfway decent card. You know, 20 cents isn't the most you could pay for a Witness Protection or anything. It's not like it's a crazy price, but I expected this to be 5 cents. But no, turns out that Rebluval, that's basically like a blue Swords to Plowshares or whatever. Yeah, people pay attention to that. This is a very, very, very good removal spell. Now, apart from all the deserts in the deck, we got to play some other lands. So we're on 8 forests and 6 islands in here. Just a little bit more forest. Obviously, we play a buttload of green. We got Glimpse the Core too, and that searches forest specifically. So yeah, we want more forest. Again, I feel like I shouldn't have to explain it too much. This is also the deck that plays the most lands. A lot of these decks today play like 22 lands or whatever, but this one's on 26 because we're a ramp deck that plays 7 drops. Let's be smart. Use our noodle. Play 26 lands. Now, as far as an overview for this one goes, this one feels really fun to play, again, specifically within the gauntlet of $5 decks. When you step out of that, you probably got to do a little bit of upgrade, more so than some of the other decks. If you're going to take this one out of this particular environment, you probably want to put some more powerful cards in it, but shouldn't be too hard to upgrade it either. That said, just one more last thing about this deck. It isn't World Soul's Rage, and it isn't Domain Ramp, but there is nothing quite like playing Map the Frontier, getting 2 dual lands, and shocking your opponent. It is a powerful play, and it feels like a powerful play when you do it. It is very powerful to play a Colossal Rattleworm on the end of your opponent's turn 3, or like during their turn 3 combat step. Like, even if they know it's in your deck, they're still like, oh crap, yeah, you do have the mana for that. So it's, you know, like, there's a lot of fun stuff this deck does, and Bonnie Paul can get out of hand, and just give it a shot, like I say with just about every deck that we've looked at already today. But this can be a very fun deck, again, especially within the context of these decks. Up next is Selesnya Mounts. I had nicknames for this, but they were all rejected by YouTube censors. Now, this is a cool deck in draft. Apparently, this is one of the scourges of draft, is the green-white deck that plays Seraphic Steed. And I can see why. Seraphic Steed is a very good card. We'll get to it in just a minute, but I honestly thought this was going to be kind of the odd one out, the not as fun, not as good sort of deck in this bunch. I was super duper wrong. This deck does tons of extremely powerful things, including one thing that I had a feeling would be powerful, but I didn't realize would be as busted as it kind of feels. Now we'll start with the absolute best stuff to mount. Aside from your mom, I'm done with these jokes for this video. I just had to get one in. I apologize. Just like your mom. Anyway, there's 4 Ornery Tumblewag, 4 Congregation Griff, and 4 the aforementioned scourge of OTJ Limited, Seraphic Steed. A Tumblewag is kind of the star of the show here, which is nice. I like that a Brushwag is doing work in 2024, man. But this thing really snowballs very quickly. It feels like having a Luminarch Aspirant or a Fight Rigging or one of these effects on the table. And as we've all played against them in Standard the last like 4 years at this point, we can all attest that this is a very, very good effect to have on your side of the table. So really, really sweet just because of that. It helps you win stalemates, and as turns go by, it'll make sure you have the biggest dudes on the table. But it also has this sweet ability where whenever it attacks, you can make something enormous, like absolutely freaking enormous. What ended up being like kind of my favorite card in the deck is Congregation Griff. This thing is deceptively sick, man. This is 3 mana for a 1/4 flying lifelink. And honestly, that is good enough. Like, it's a surprising amount of the time. This blocks like everything in the air, on the ground, whatever, and gains you life and doesn't die. But when you finally can get it saddled up, it's going to end up getting like +2/+2, +3/+3 some of the time. And that means you're flying over for like at least 3-4 lifelink damage in the air. And that's, phenomenally good. That's so freaking good, dude. So I'm telling you, this is good whether it's kind of turned on or not. And if it's getting counters from Ornery Tumblewag every turn, even better. The amount of times this has been like a 6-power lifelinker just because of counters from Tumblewag and doubling the number of counters on it and blah, blah, blah. This is a very dangerous creature is what I'm getting at. And if you played in the OTJ Limited, you also happen to know that Seraphic Steed is a very dangerous card too. Those are like, they remind me of knight stats. You guys remember they would print knights back in the day, and they would be like 2/2 first strikes with another keyword ability a lot of the time. It's a knight. It reminds me of a knight. But if it ever actually does get saddled up, it just spits out 3/3 angels. That's gross, dude. And like, there's plenty of ways to get it saddled up in this deck. Even if your creatures don't start with the proper power toughness to do it, Ornery Tumblewag can put counters on stuff and get it big enough to saddle this, and then suddenly you are getting in. This deck also plays a couple of copies of Drover Grizzly in here, but we've got 4 Frontier Seeker and 4 Intrepid Stablemaster, one of the more important cards in the deck. But on Grizzly for just a second, I wanted a couple of more mounts in the deck for pretty obvious reasons. We are a mounts deck. We care how many mounts we have, but there's not too many amazing mounts in Standard. But Grizzly is just good enough to get a couple of slots. This can crew Seraphic Steed with its power, which is kind of important. It can crew Congregation Griff too, for what it's worth. And it can also give a bunch of dudes trample, and if you're trying to bust through that stalemate with your Ornery Tumblewag, getting stuff swole or whatever with the counters and doubling the number of counters and blah, trample is going to matter a good bit a lot of the time. But Frontier Seeker, man, you want to talk about being impressed by a card, dude. This is kind of an ambitious farmhand or a Knight of the White Orchid or one of the millions of white 2-drops they printed at this point that goes and gets a plains, right? There's a lot of these, but this is a 2-power guy, which is just way better than most of the ways that we have access of getting a plains with, you know, in Standard right now. But this is also going to find mounts. So this is a 2-mana, 2-power thing that draws a creature. And that's just a solid magic card, no matter how you slice it. It's going to get you some sort of card advantage one way or the other, about 90% of the time. I have had it whiff on me, but even if it whiffs on you, you have a thing that can block or, more importantly, saddle up a bunch of the dudes in the deck. So, yeah, Frontier Seeker is 100% worth playing, but so is Stablemaster, to say the least, dude. Like, just the fact that this is normal ramp is kind of good enough a lot of the time, but the fact that this is double ramp for not only mounts, but vehicles, and we'll get to why that's important in a second, is just heinous, dude. Like, the fact that, first of all, we don't have like any 5-mana mounts in this deck, but what we do have is a bunch of 2- and 3-mana mounts. So this can tap to play a mount. some of the time. It can tap for 2/3 of the mana to play a mount and leave the rest of our mana open for tricks or other things we need to do, and that is just so super important a lot of the time. This is a very, very good card. But the trick in the deck is the 4 copies of Mysterious Limousine. Now, we've also got 4 copies of Throw from the Saddle and 2 copies of Steer Clear while we're looking at removal spells. So again, an aggro deck with a total of 10 removal spells in it. Mysterious Limousine is just gross. On turn 2, we can play it in Intrepid Stable Master, and on turn 3, because of Stable Master, we can play Mysterious Limousine. That is a 4/4 that gets crewed by every single creature, just about, in the entire deck, and denies the opponent their best creature when it comes into play. Best card in the deck. Mysterious Limousine's always been kind of a halfway low-key, very good, low-played vehicle in and of itself. But once you're able to play it on turn 3, even if you're on the draw, it's just a very, very good way to recover, It's just super swingy play. You get your own effective 4/4, and you take away your opponent's best creature. Just absolutely, undeniably very good. And there's plays where you can, crew the limousine and then use the limousine to saddle up, Seraphic Steed and make a 3/3 flyer. And that's also good. So Limousine is just absolutely one of the funnier cards in the deck, and one of the better ones too. But Throw from the Saddle and Steer Clear, again, are just more sort of traditional removal for a deck like this. But they're also both very good, effective removal spells, especially if you're getting stuff big with Ornery Tumblewag and stuff. Throw from the Saddle can be great. But the last couple of cards in the deck are just as important as all the other ones, man. There's 3 copies of Miriam Herd Whisperer and 2 copies of Wily Duke, Atian Hero. Now, Wily Duke, I keep wanting to say crew, this can saddle up even the stoutest of mounts in this deck. Everything from the smallest dudes to a Seraphic Steed, this can saddle up. And when it does so, you draw a card and gain a life. Now, I said that Make Your Move is the only card draw spell in any of these decks, but Wily Duke is basically the second best way of drawing cards. Third best way of drawing cards. We'll get to the second best way when we get to the last deck, but still, Wily Duke does draw a fair amount of cards over the course of the game, and often amounts to just drawing an extra card every turn. Your own personal Howling Mine that also gains you life is very disgusting when it also happens to crew all the best things in the deck. So yes, play Wily, but Miriam, this just so happens to give you the sort of get off my stuff ability as long as it's your turn, which can be really important when you're trying to set up, what you're going to crew, what you're going to saddle, what you're going to put counters on in the first place with Ornery Tumblewag or Miriam herself, right? Because whenever you play a mount or, a vehicle, whenever one attacks, rather, you get to put +1/+1 counters on them. So that's making your vehicle, your Mysterious Limousine, like a 5/5. That is really comboing well with Ornery Brushwag, or Tumblewag, rather, to make sure that you're putting extra counters on stuff and you're getting, whenever you're doubling the number of +1/+1 counters on a thing, you're getting a lot of value out of that if you have Miriam and Tumblewag on the table. So just an absolutely brutal 2-drop that may not saddle everything in the deck, not Seraphic Steed, but it saddles everything else, and that's really important too. So Miriam is just a bomb of a card in this deck, and we need decent 2-drops to kind of set up all of our, mounty plays, I guess, and this is just about the best 2-drop the deck can have access to. Now, here are the lands. We're actually playing the traditional recommended 24 in this one because there's the 5-drop in our deck, so we're playing 24 lands in this thing, even with the ramp, but it's also the only deck that, I guess, besides Deserts, that I'm just going to throw Blossoming Sands into, or some other, dual land like that, I guess. I mean, Blossoming Sands is 3 to 5 cents right now, and there's no really real 1-drops in the deck, so I think we can stand 1 tap land in this thing, and I think Blossoming Sands is a pretty good pick. But if you got a couple of just random green-white tap lands laying around, throw them in. Overview time again. I just did not expect this deck to be fun. When I first even came up with the idea, I was like, it's kind of hacky, right, to just do mounts. Everyone expects it. Everyone's seen it in draft. It's not powerful enough for standard, right? Actually, I don't know. Maybe we should give this deck another look, man. Just the Mysterious Limousine trick is enough to body decks, real decks in standard. It's actually really good and can carry you through some of the way against those lists. But again, if you're given the breathing room to actually get these Miriam into Tumblewag snowballs generated and going, then whoo, boy, we can actually sometimes match Boros in terms of intensity depending on what their start is. It really surprised me with just how playable some of the synergies in this thing are. But again, for the most part, it's a $5 deck for a reason, but it feels very powerful for a $5 deck. So get on your horses and ride. But the last deck we're going to look at today is Rakdos Outlaws. Yeah, after YouTube rejected all the nicknames for the last one, it was kind of demoralizing. I didn't want to come up with a nickname. So Rakdos Outlaws, everybody. And this is one that's actually kind of near and dear. There's a reason that I started the video with an Orzhov deck, and there's a reason I'm ending the video with what is basically an Aristocrats deck, because you already know these things about me. I love these things. Now, this one starts with 4 copies of Vile Smasher. I don't love playing 4 copies of a Legend, but we gotta play 4 copies of this guy. There's also 4 copies of Rakish Crew and 2 copies of a weird one, Brimstone Roundup. I'll get to that in a second, but first, my dude, Vile Smasher, Corpse Knight, but for Outlaws, and also Legendary. Cool commander. Really, really sweet commander. I want to build that deck so bad, but this is the deck we're talking about for right now. And in terms of like incremental damage, which you already know I'm addicted to, even if it's bad, I love incremental damage. But in terms of incremental damage, this is actually a very, very, very good source of it, given that we're playing so many Outlaws in this deck and so many things that create Outlaws. Again, we'll get to Brimstone Roundup in a second, but Rakish Crew. This creates an outlaw when it comes into play and curves really well with Vile Smasher. Whether they're coming into play or leaving play, we're dealing some damage to our opponent. I mean, this basically gives us a Bastion of Remembrance. If you don't know what that is, it basically gives us a Blood Artist. If you don't know what that is, Zulaport Cutthroat. There's a lot of these throughout Magic history. I'm just really glad that we got one that's sort of outlaw specific in OTJ. But when you add Brimstone Roundup to the mix, you don't need 4 copies of this. I'm going to tell you that right away. And I rarely plotted this card. Seriously. But once you actually do get it down, once you get a couple of things, once you get a couple of spells going, son or daughter, then you're really in the money, man. You're getting a lot of like pings off of Vile Smasher. You're getting a lot of eventual pings off of Rakish Crew when those creatures die, and you're getting mercenaries that can make your other creatures bigger. And there's a couple of creatures you'd really like to make swole in this deck. So Brimstone Roundup is sweet, man. It just helps us go a little bit wider. It helps us get more value out of our 2 sort of premier signposty build around cards that are also on screen right now. And honestly, again, I wouldn't make this a 4-of, but it did treat me a lot better than I thought it would. I kind of thought this would be a meme I'd kick out of the deck really fast, but no, I think 2 is the exact right number. I'm sticking with it. But there's also 4 Fairy Dream Thief and 4 Okibo Reckoner Raid. Again, we get to play this card in this deck as we start in our group of Outlaws that we're playing in this thing. Now, Fairy Dream Thief is a great candidate usually for mercenary buffs. You know, if you got a couple of mercenaries out, give that +1/+0 to your Fairy Dream Thief, fly over for like 3. It feels okay, man. It's not bad, but this also draws us a card, gets us Surveils to get us closer to our combo pieces and set up our draws and all that. So Dream Thief is just chef's kiss. Wonderful. One of the better Outlaws we can play, literally. But Okibo Reckoner Raid, man, we have to wait a little bit on this, but it does line up with Vile Smasher well. You know, you get Okibo Reckoner Raid on 1, Vile Smasher on 2, and then on turn 3, right as you draw your card, you get a 2/2 and a shot off of Vile Smasher because a rogue came into play. That's an outlaw. So just really, really sweet card here as a 1/2 with Vile Smasher, but just a good card in its own right too, and helps us stack up that damage for what it's worth. And it's worth a lot, but there's also 4 copies of Nezumi Link Breaker and 2 copies of Forsaken Miner, mostly for budget reasons. You could flip these numbers, but I really like Link Breaker in a deck like this, where we're mostly looking to make more Outlaws to deal damage with Vile Smasher. We're mostly looking to make more Outlaws to deal damage with Rakish Crew. So this is, you know, a Doomed Traveler crawling chorus. So there's, again, a million creatures just like this, but this is the best version we have available to us because it makes Outlaws on both ends. So just absolutely dumb card for a deck like this. We're Aristocrats. We want a Doom Traveler. Let's play Link Breaker. Apart from that, there's also 4 copies of Morbid Opportunist. If you're waiting for the other best way to draw cards in these decks, this is probably the second best way, or maybe even the actual best way of drawing cards is Opportunist. But there's also 2 copies of Hellspur Posse Boss and 4 copies of Hellspur Brute, which is kind of the secret card in this deck, the secret amazing card in this deck, but we'll get to it. Morbid Opportunist is just a way to draw cards. We don't have ways really of like sacking dudes. We're just assuming our opponent is going to kill our dudes in combat, and usually that works. You know, and if we have ways of killing our opponent's guys, then Opportunist will trigger on that too. So Morbid Opportunist doesn't necessarily have to be in an Aristocrats deck that's sacking a bunch of dudes every turn or whatever to be a playable card. This will usually get you a card every turn just because it's on the table at all. So again, just an absolutely brutally good card, and counts as an outlaw. So Heck yeah, man. But Hellspur Posse Boss, board in a box, does a lot of damage with Vile Smasher the moment that you play it. That's awesome. Also gives the rest of your outlaws haste and kind of a little boost too. So yeah, let's go. It gives the mercenaries that it creates haste. So again, those mercenaries can immediately make like a Fairy Dream Thief, have large power and get in. Just a lot of stuff to do with this card. But it's a 4-drop, and I honestly didn't feel like it was really worth putting in more than a 2-of, but I could be wrong. This card has a pretty massive impact on the game every time it comes down, but so does Hellspur Brute, man. This is a big boy that often comes down on like turn 3. Also, you get to play a cowboy in the cowboy set, an actual literal cowboy in the cowboy set. That's, I don't know, there's something to be said for that, but still, I really think people are sleeping on this thing, man. I don't know how good it actually is in standard or anything, but I have surprised many an actual real life, not $5 opponent with a 1-mana Hellspur Brute that somehow has haste because I have a Posse Boss out. And there are a couple of more cards in the deck we got to get to as well. There's 1 copy of Zoyoa Lava Tongue that I believe the only one of in the entire 5 decks, but there's also 4 copies of Shoot the Sheriff in this deck for real true outlaw flavor. Now the Lava Tongue, this started off as a 3-of, but it's just not that good. It's we descend some of the time. Again, though, we don't force the descend ever. And sometimes when we do descend, it's with a token, mercenary or something like that. So I don't know. This card just doesn't feel amazing, but sometimes it feels okay. We're able to attack with an Azumi Link Breaker, lose it in combat, force this decision on him with Zoyoa, and get like extra value off Rakish Crew and stuff. It feels okay, but I really don't think you need more than a Silver Bullet Zoyoa in this deck. We're mostly doing this to play more 2-drops. But again, I don't think you need extra copies. Now, Shoot the Sheriff. Just, again, a ridiculously inexpensive, very good, very reliable, most of the time removal spell that I really think we should be playing more of. Now, there's 21 lands in this deck, just to kind of bring it home. We got 11 swamps and 10 mountains. Again, this one honestly feels like I should probably sneak at least another land into it because we're playing a 4-drop, right? But I thankfully have not had too many mana problems when playing this deck, which is probably just being fortunate. But again, I think this one might on some level need another land, but what it mostly wants to do is play like 1 and 2 mana outlaws for like the first 3 or 4 turns of the game, and that's awesome. I love doing that. Just like getting, again, more value off of Vile Smasher, getting down that Rakish Crew, that Bastion of Remembrance, getting down that Rakish Crew, and then on the next couple of turns, just playing out the rest of your hand, getting all them dudes on the table, and hopefully you can take it home with damage from Vile Smasher, combat damage from Rakish Crew. It just feels really good to count to 20 with a deck like this, and maybe I'm just hardwired to like stuff like this, and it's just me or whatever, but I had a ton of fun doing the math with this thing. And I guess that's my overview of this deck. Much like some of the other decks, we do have build-arounds in this deck. Rakish Crew and Brimstone Roundup and Vile Smasher. These are all like super build-aroundy cards, but most of the other cards in the deck don't necessarily need those cards in order to function and be decent Magic cards. Like Fairy Dream Thief, Morbid Opportunist, Okeeper Reckoner Raid, Forsaken Miner. These are all just good cards in and of themselves, and I think that's kind of the secret to a decent budget deck. You want that synergy, but you also want your deck to be good if it doesn't draw its key pieces. And again, this deck is somewhat capable of being able to withstand attacks and block with stuff until it can get to its good stuff. Just shoot down stuff with Shoot the Sheriff and swing over with Fairy Dream Thief and other small guys like Okeeper Reckoner Raid. So this can just play a normal game of Magic sometimes, but when you really are firing on all cylinders, you got a Vile Smasher in place, Rakish Crew in place, and a couple of tokens or whatever, man, you just feel like you're unbeatable. So feels like Blood Artist in 2008, but enough about me. This is just a really, really fun deck, just like all these other decks, honestly. I was surprised at how fun the budget was this time, because sometimes I feel like with these videos I end up making a bunch of sort of rote normal decks. This one's mono green, this one's mono black, and we didn't have to do that this time around. And not only did we end up with some fun decks that are unique and do cool stuff, but again, also we're surprisingly competitive when you actually take them into the arena. But with that, everybody, I think we've done it. The 5 for 5 is in the books, and now we're going to have to do another one before too long because rotation's going to happen. Bloomborough is going to be in. Got to do a 5 for 5 for Bloomborough. I really want to start doing these again because it's been way too long, like I said, and when I started actually looking into what you can do on a budget and standard, I felt the old fire in me again for the first time in a good long time, man. Budget is still a viable option in standard, and I'm kind of surprised by that given how ridiculous all the rares and mythics in standard are, but a rising tide does lift all ships. The commons and uncommons have gotten just as ridiculous as the rares and mythics in a lot of ways, and it is amazing what you can do on a $5 budget right now. Half the fun for me in making these videos is just sort of the challenge that I have to go through of building a deck for just $5, and I really don't know that I've gotten a crop this good in the history of this video before, and that's, again, mostly because card quality has risen dramatically since I've started doing this series, but I'm not going to complain too much. When you can do this much, like, unique, cool stuff on a budget, there's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, that's it. Just let me know what your favorite budget decks in Standard are right now. Anything you can do for $5-10 that's able to hang with the boys, you know? Like, let us know in the comments section. And of course, let us know what your favorite ones are here, the ones you plan to grab for yourself or whatever. You can grab the whole set. Deck lists are in the description, along with Patreon, Twitch, videos that we've done recently on the channel, all the whole treasure trove of stuff. Check out the description for all that stuff. But again, call to action. It's time for that because it's the end of the video. That's how you're supposed to make a YouTube video. Make sure you like. Just as simple as thumbs upping the video. I know it's lame and nobody does it. Nobody likes doing it. You feel stupid doing it. But just this one time, if you could like the video, put in more recommended feeds. I'd like to get this one out there a little bit more and let everybody know that we're doing 5 for 5 again. It's a thing people seem to like back in the day. But aside from that, you could just straight up share it around if you want to. I know nobody does that either. You could sub to the channel. Nobody does that either. It's 2024. But again, maybe just this one time for this one guy. You sub to a sandwich. But aside from that, there's also the Patreon. That's really the only way that I'm able to continue doing the YouTube thing for a living at all. I appreciate all my Patreon people. Thank you very much for allowing me to have an existence on my couch talking about Magic. That's incredible. If you want to be one of those people, it's just about $1 a month. There are other tiers, but all I really ask is $1 a month, and you can vote on what decks we do around here if you're in the Patreon club. But honestly, if you're still watching at this point, I'm just glad that you're here. I always say it, but I mean it. You know, watch time matters, and honestly, so does just the fact that you're still here. It means a lot to me sentimentally. But in any case, I'm going to get out of here for this one, guys. Just let me know how you felt about all the stuff down there in the comments section, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. It feels really good to do a 5 for 5 again. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.